Hi, everybody. My name is Josh Smith. I'm your resident plant dork. Before I get into all the awesome details of breeding, what we could be doing in our backyards of developing fruits and nuts for Alaska's conditions, I first and foremost want to acknowledge the fact that I'm a visitor on Dena'ina land. I want to pay forward my respect to the elders of past and present and the stewardship they've afforded in conjunction with this landscape since time immemorial. I know this to be true that through indigenous sovereignty, leadership, and education, and maybe some awesome edible plant propagation and native plant propagation, the abundance of this land can be protected and preserved for generations to come. So let's all be part of that, and let's grow some awesome plants and develop some new cultivars for Alaska's conditions. So first and foremost, those of you who have been part of my presentations in the past, I'm Neurospicy and this is my hyperfixation. I try not to talk too fast, but it is what it is. I'm usually just as surprised with what I say as you guys will be. So we'll get through it together. With that, this isn't necessarily a formal presentation. I don't have a PowerPoint slide by slide of all the points I'm going to be covering. I mainly just put pictures on there so you have something to look at other than my floating head. And we'll discuss the pictures. And hopefully, I want to kind of engage a conversation because this could go the direction I want it to, and cool, we're gonna have that conversation, that presentation. But what's really the value if you don't feel inspired walking from this? So if you have questions, if you have experiences, if you have something you want to elaborate on, or if somebody else in the audience has something to expand upon, the goal here is not necessarily me teaching anybody anything. It's just us collectively walking away inspired, motivated, with a little more knowledge, so we can all be doing this within our own backyards and our communities. So I also want to hit the point home that I'm not any sort of authority on the subject. I am not a horticulturist. I'm just a nerd who likes to nerd with other nerds. So hopefully we can kind of make it through this and we can all just be part of the citizen science project and develop new varieties. Because like the picture right there you see in the slideshow, that's an Evans sour cherry. It was a chance seedling found in somebody's backyard outside of Edmonton, Alberta by Dr. Evans. So it just goes to show that varietals and new varieties of fruits and nuts, they have been grown, that like we ask ourselves how they came to be. They were a seedling at one point, and that's the Evans sour cherry that everybody has in their backyards. All originated from one tree in Edmonton, Alberta. But we'll talk a little more on that. So let's see if I can do this without exiting the screen. Oh, hey. So here's proof of concept, some of the things I've been doing. Before I get into all the juicy details when it comes to propagating our native plants, I want to ask Ivo, what would be your favorite fruit that you'd go to the grocery store and go buy?
I think Cosmic Crisp apples.
Ooh, good choice. So Cosmic Crisp is fun because it was actually, I believe, again, and Charles, you can probably call me out if I'm wrong here, but it's actually a cross from the University of Minnesota between the Honeycrisp apple and the Liberty apple. They were trying to basically induce more storage capability with the Honeycrisp. And so taking those awesome genetics of the Honeycrisp and basically improving the storage capabilities. But the thing is if you wanted more, let's mind you, there's legal issues. You can't just grow a Cosmic Crisp anywhere you want because the University of Minnesota has rights to that cultivar. But the thing is if you wanted more Honeycrisp or more Cosmic Crisp varieties or apples in your yard, if you wanted to plant a tree, you take the seeds from that apple and you plant it. You're not going to get another Cosmic Crisp apple. The thing when you have offspring, just like if you imagine mom and dad have 10 kids, each child will have characteristics of both parent, but not none of the children will be an exact clone of that parent. So now we can apply that to apples, especially apples that require cross-pollination, like one that's been crossed with the Honeycrisp and the Liberty apple. You plant seedlings of that, it's going to be the offspring that you get are going to be some variation between the Cosmic Crisp and whatever the pollen parent is. So you're going to end up, that seedling that you grow will be genetically its own unique apple that has never been seen. And it may be absolutely wonderful and it may be terrible. And that's the thing, when you plant seedlings, when it comes to orchard culture, like you want to go grow a whole orchard of Cosmic Crisps, obviously planting seeds is not the way to go because unfortunately, what happened, you end up with a lot of variability. You're not going to have a consistent crop, which is the bane of an orchard, like orchard culture's existence. You want uniformity, you want predictability, you want a uniform product that you can sell at markets. But when you're crazy like Laskins and you have a little bit of a curious spirit, that's where we can actually start planting some of these seeds and actually come up with new varieties. So, so basically, that's the cool thing about us being in Alaska, or actually, I mean, anybody. If you have a curious spirit, you can absolutely go plant seeds and see what that apple becomes. And that's kind of the cool experiment here. And these are some of my experiments I'm doing at my nursery in Chugiak. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see various beds of seedlings. A lot of those are Manchurian apricots and some hazelnuts and some shellbark hickory. Because I'm running these experiments real time as we go as well. But the thing is each of those little apricot trees, because they were grown from seed. Those specifically were actually, Charles, you know Jim. I got seeds from his open pollinated Manchurian apricot down in Fargo, North Dakota. All these amazing varieties of apricot grafted on the same tree, all cross-pollinated with each other. And basically, I bought seeds from him and planted them. So each of those will be its own unique individual. They may not be an exact clone of any of the cultivars, but when you have big, delicious apricot cross-pollinating with a big, delicious apricot, chances are there's going to be some big, delicious apricots in that mix. And then we basically just grow them out and see if they can adapt to Alaska's conditions and kind of go from there. So, and then on the right hand side, you actually see the apricot seedlings up close. So, talking about apples. So the thing is like your Cosmic Crisp, your Honey Crisp, these are all varieties that were developed within the university system. University of Minnesota is one of the best ones in the nation. And I think I read some statistic where basically they go through the process of, okay, they have a Cosmic Crisp apple, but they want new varieties. They're constantly trying to get the latest and greatest. So they're crossing Cosmic Crisp apples with new varieties. And they're trying to basically create something that's better for storage, something that's better tree structure, better taste, better texture, things that are going to be basically better luster, things that will result in better sales within grocery stores or within processing, things that consumers are looking for. So they're always moving on to the latest and greatest. And you understand that every seedling is going to be genetically its own unique individual. So at that point, if you're trying to discover the next Cosmic Crisps apple, it's a numbers game. It's planting enough seedlings and making enough controlled crosses, and eventually you will end up with one that's a superstar. The statistic that's always thrown out there is for a university program to develop a new variety of apple, it's basically one out of every 10,000 seedlings will suffice and basically make it reach those standards. And so for those of us who are backyard growers, we think of that and we're like, oh, how is that even doable? One in 10,000 seedlings. You see my little patch right there. I have like what, 40 seedlings of 2-year-old apples. And so the chances of any of those being the next Honeycrisp is almost non-existent. But that's the thing though. We think about the 1 in 10,000 statistic. We don't have to reach for the stars here. The 1 in 10,000 statistic is they're disease resistant, they are large, they store well, they're crisp, they're tasty, they're juicy. And actually, if we look at some of them, like the Red Delicious, gosh knows they don't meet any of those parameters. They just store really well. But the thing is like what's marketable in the grocery stores and what grows really well in the Yakima Valley of Washington or in southern Minnesota doesn't necessarily equate to the best apple. We talk about the best apples that we've eaten, and half the time the best apples you've eaten are these unknown varieties or these little known varieties that are grown in these heritage orchards or these people's backyards, varieties that may not even be they may be disease, they may have be susceptible to diseases in certain regions. They may be susceptible to cold or to heat. They may have incompatibility issues. The fruit may spoil fairly quickly. But the thing is that apple, when you go to eat it, may be one of the best apples on the planet, but it didn't make the cut because it just wasn't marketable within our capitalist society. That's the thing, though. We don't have to reach for the stars. When we're growing apples here in Alaska, growing orchards and having commercial varieties, the thing is we are never going to be the next Yakima Valley of Washington. We're never going to be growing apples that we have to store for a year and then sell on grocery shelves. We can actually just grow delicious varieties of apples in our backyard and process them or find varieties that'll store for a couple months in our root cellars. The thing is the best apples we're going to grow here in Alaska are not the ones that are going to be grown in the Yakima Valley that store for a year. So the thing is, when you actually basically change your parameters in your mindset, suddenly the numbers game isn't that bad. I think there was it was with Geneva, New York, where I forget the statistics I saw, but they planted like it was 50 or 100 seedlings, and out of that there was over a dozen varieties that they actually selected. And this was years and years ago, but they selected, and that's how like Cortland came to be. So the thing is like we don't necessarily have to come up with the next Honeycrisp. We just want delicious apples that are hardy and resistant to Alaska's conditions. We think of varieties like your rescue apple, which is one of the most tried and true varieties. It's an 1.5 inch wide apple crab, and it's been grown in Matsu Valley for probably 100 years. And it's been grown up in Fairbanks for probably at least 50 years, hardy to zone 2. The thing is, originally, that was just a cross between a glorified doggo apple and I want to say Melba. I could be wrong there. But the thing is or So basically, it was a cross between a glorified crabapple and a full-size standard apple, and now we have one of the most tried true varieties of apple that all of us Alaskans absolutely love. The thing is they're small, they don't last very long, so they're never going to be one you buy on the grocery shelves. But they're ones that we all have in our orchards because they've proven themselves to Alaska's conditions. They're hardy, they're reliable, they produce every year, and they're tasty. You grab a handful of rescue apples and you just snack on them. You'll never see them on the store shelves, but they don't necessarily have to meet those parameters for them to be worthy of being grown in our backyards. So, I'm trying to think of how to go. So basically, let's say this apple on the right-hand side, that's a Carol apple that I actually was looking at in my orchard earlier this season. Let's say I cross-pollinated that. I took pollen from, let's say I have a variety called Dibble, which is a red-fleshed crab apple. Let's say I wanted to create a new red-fleshed apple that was tasty. I could go over, if they're both blooming at the same time, I could go over to my Dibble apple. I can go collect flowers when there's pollen available and actually literally just go do the job of a bee and go artificially pollinate it. I could put a little cloth bag over it afterwards to make sure the bees don't come in behind me and put other pollen there. And at that point, now I've crossed the genetics of the two I want. Now it's just waiting for the fruit to develop. Let the fruit develop, let the seeds ripen. And then once that happens, you harvest the fruit and you save those seeds. Assuming the seeds are ripe and they're brown, you can actually save those seeds. You grow them. You now have an offspring between those two apples, this big delicious Carol apple and a red fleshed crab apple. And the thing is some may be pink flesh, some may be red flesh, some may be white flesh, some may be delicious, some may be bitter, some may be hardy to his Alaska's conditions, some may not be. But that's kind of the fun experiment of it. And so that's kind of what I'm encouraging folks to do. You look on that patch right there. I got those from my friend Kent out in Wasilla, and he actually makes controlled pollen crosses within his apple orchard. He makes some, like he'll cross a rescue with a Norland for fun, but he'll also bring in pollen from apple orchards in lower 48 of columnar apples and red fleshed apples and basically desirable characteristics. And he's trying to instill those characteristics in our hardy Alaska apples. So he'll take that pollen, he'll go cross pollinate a rescue with something red fleshed. And then he'll save those seeds. And he's been distributing the seeds all across the state of Alaska. And so a couple years ago, he did that with just me. Or not just me, but I did just that. I took the seeds and apples being a temperate species, you have to undergo cold stratification. The seeds won't germinate fresh. Typically, they need a cold treatment. So then I took the dried seeds he sent me, soaked them in water for 12 hours, mixed them in a small baggie with sphagnum peat moss, and put them in the fridge for, I think it's anywhere 30, 60, 90 days. I'd have to get you an exact number. And then from there, you pull them out, and within a week, you'll see little radicals. You'll see them start growing. You take them, you can grow them up in plug trays, or you can just in the spring sow them in your garden beds. Let them grow out for a year or two. If you want, you can absolutely let each of these seedlings plant them out, let them grow. I think it's probably 7 to 10 years reasonably, probably even more here in Alaska before you ever see any sort of fruit production. So it's a long turnaround if you're waiting for any of these seedlings to whether it has the characteristics you want. It kind of sucks if you grow an apple for 12 years and all it produces are little bitter crab apples. Mind you, there's still use for that. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the thing is there's ways you can actually speed up that timeline, and that's where grafting comes in. So, mind you,
So, sorry, Josh, just Chad asked, does a rescue apple need to be grafted or does it grow and produce well from root? But maybe you're about to get into that.
So most rescue apples that we have are going to be grafted here locally, but you could absolutely take a seed from a rescue crab apple and plant it, but it won't necessarily be a rescue at that point. There are some varieties or some cultivars that are pretty stable. Like if you take seeds from a Doggo crab apple, the little guys that we have all around town, realistically the offspring is going to be pretty close to a Doggo with some variability. Rescue being an apple crab between a standard apple and a crab, you're going to end up with intermediate characteristics of whatever the rescue is and whatever the pollen parent is. So most rescue that you have are going to be grafted at least at some point. I don't know of many apples that can be propagated via cuttings. I know probably with some tissue culture, but most apples here locally are going to be grafted. Does that answer your question? Hopefully. Sorry, I can't actually see that. So where was I going with that? So basically, I was talking about how, grafting. So basically, each of these seedlings, I let them grow for 2 years. They're now about 3 feet tall, and they went dormant this last year. I could absolutely go dig these up and go plant them in a nursery row, let them grow out, wait 7, 10, 12 years for them to produce fruit and discover that only one of them is worth anything. or we can graft them. So what's cool about these is these are young trees. They know that they have to grow for years and years and establish themselves before they can ever even think about producing fruit. But if you take basically once this goes dormant, you just have a stick sticking up, you can actually harvest some of that first year wood and go graft it onto either a dwarfing rootstock or you can graft it onto an established tree. Let's say you have a big rescue apple and you don't need that many crab apples. Go sacrifice a couple branches, cut them off, and graft a couple of these little branches on in the spring. Once things have warmed up, it's no longer freezing. Let them grow. Because you're grafting them onto a mature tree that already knows that, hey, I can produce apples, it'll actually expedite how quickly that these actually start producing. So at that point, you may be looking at 3 to 5 years before you have your first fruit, which makes the turnaround a lot more feasible. There's some folks in the lower 48 that will graft them onto dwarfing rootstocks like Bud 9, which will then even expedite the production of apples even faster. Unfortunately, the dwarfing rootstocks aren't always the greatest here. They're kind of hit or miss. So it's something that's worthy of trial. But if you have an ornamental crabapple in your backyard, you can literally just try growing seedlings and graft of different varieties, kind of create a Frankenstein tree, which I think is way more fun than just a flowering crabapple. But then you can each branch, and don't be a Josh, make sure you actually label like, okay, hey, I made a pollen cross between the rescue and the Dibble, and so this should be red flesh, or at least that's the cross that I made. And so when in 3 to 5 years, when it produces fruit, you could be like, oh, what was that cross? I'll never know what these crosses are because I don't label anything. But if you do better than me, you can at least know, hey, I made this cross and this is what the outcome was. So in reality, that's
So, Josh, how do you make a pollen cross? Like, what are the steps
you
of doing
basically
that?
play the game of a bee. So when the flowers are fully open and you see the pollen actually out, like I'm unfortunately the anatomy of a flower, I don't have the words, but when you actually see the pollen available, you can literally just go grab a flower. You can grab a Q-tip and collect some of the pollen, and then go over to there and dab it on the flower or in the flower. Basically, you're going to basically be taking the place of the bee. So you're basically transferring pollen from one flower to the other. These apples typically are not self-fruitful, so they're going to need pollen from a dissimilar apple. Two rescues will typically not cross-pollinate and produce a good set of fruit. But if you have another variety, it's going to have unique pollen that can then cross-pollinate. So you'd basically just go pretend to be a bee. You can go grab a flower to bring it over and dab the pollen over with a Q-tip, or I will remove the petals and I'll literally just jam the flower in there and rub it around. That way you're getting adequate pollination. And then again, if you don't want a bee to come in and basically undo your work, then you could put like a little cloth, something over it until pollination is done and the fruit starts to set. So hopefully that answered the question. Cool.
Yeah. Someone asked, what labels do you use that last over the years? But it sounds like you don't really use labels.
I'm trying to do better. I hear responsible nursery owners are supposed to label their plants for whatever reason, so I'm trying to do better with that. I'm still neurospicy and I have my own tendencies I'm fighting daily. But actually my favorite you can get on Amazon or some of the local some of the gardening stores. There's these little aluminum tags that have these little metal. Mind you, be careful where you put them because if you put them around the main trunk and you leave them, you're going to girdle your tree over time. But if you take these little aluminum tags, you can just they're soft enough that you can literally just write on them, and then you just hang it from one of the little branches, make sure the wind doesn't blow away, secure it in some capacity. Some people will actually they'll zip tie them to branches. Some people will use the metal tags. Some people will use a little placard underneath. There's lots of options, but the most resilient I have found are those little aluminum tags. Anything that you write, it's Alaska's gonna undo it eventually with our freeze and wet and dry. So I would definitely recommend the aluminum tags. But if somebody else has another recommendation, I'd love to hear it. So I'm still working on that myself. Um, so basically, like for perspective, that bed of seedlings I have right there, my goal is I'm going to be doing both. I'm going to be actually taking all those seedlings, I'm going to be cutting off the top of each one of them and taking that piece of sign wood, I'm going to be labeling it, and then I'm going to be grafting it onto my big rescue, my big Norland apple, because I don't need that many rescue and Norland apples. But I'm also the roots underneath, I'm going to go plant those too and go plant them along the boundary of my property. They're going to grow as apple trees. Some of them may be good, some of them may not be bad. But once you learn that grafting skill, which I'm telling you, bark grafts and top working grafts are actually remarkably easy and the success rate is really high. A couple of YouTube videos, maybe go to a grafting workshop in the spring, highly recommend. But the thing is if I grow one of those apple trees on the border of my property and it's terrible, like the apples are horrible, but the tree is still persisting and growing, instead of the tree has now transitioned its role. It's no longer an experimental fruit bearing variety that I'm trying to figure out. It is now a rootstock for new seedlings. So think of it as a foundation for more grafting work to be done. So that's kind of the cool, like it's never really a waste. It's just an opportunity to kind of just keep experimenting. Um, I don't know if I mentioned this, but like most university programs, when they're doing this, it's like over 20,000 seedlings at any given time. I think that's the most recent statistic I saw with the University of Minnesota. So the thing is they're doing this nonstop. They're going through seedling, 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 and if one doesn't meet the cut, it's cold immediately. They move on to the next one. Here in Alaska, we're not in a rush. We can kind of figure that out as we go. And I think apples are one of those areas that there's a lot of room for us to find some amazing varieties from growing these seedlings. Because in reality, we've been waiting here in Alaska, especially with climate change and things have changed, things are ripening now that wouldn't have ripened 100 years ago. And we've relied on other cold regions of the world to develop varieties, and then we come trial them here. You look at chestnut apple, which was developed in Minnesota. You look at what else? Okay, I'll just stick with the chestnut for now. Honeycrisp was developed in Minnesota. The thing is these varieties were developed in other cold regions, university programs that are well funded, and basically they have the resources to develop these cultivars. Well, our university system won't be funded, so the thing is, it's a citizen science project, and basically instead of relying on other cold regions to develop varieties that could potentially grow here, and then we have to bring them in and try them and see if they're adaptable, we can real time start figuring out and kind of developing our own varieties by growing seedlings. We don't need a big renowned university program to develop these. The thing is, as Alaskans, we've kind of always been made of some grit and we've always tried thought outside the box. So I think it's very realistic for Alaskans to grow some seedling apples, graft some of them, grow some of them out, and that's how we're going to find some of the great varieties to grow in our backyards. And I'm going to have some examples of not apples, but some plums that did exactly that. So, oh, speaking
Sorry.
yeah.
Eve asked, do you have to graft apple to apple or can you do apple to any kind of fruit tree?
Unfortunately, so grafting is a funny science. Typically, it's within the same genus. So if you're grafting apples which belong to the genus Malus, you'd want to graft it on a fellow Malus species. But then there's some that they basically, if their evolution has taken them far enough apart, they've grown like millions of years apart, they may not necessarily be compatible anymore. So there's some standard apples that we can't necessarily graft onto Siberian crabapple, or they'll grow for a couple years and then delayed incompatibility will kick in. They'll kind of abort because it's just they're not close related enough. There's there's some instances where you have varieties like you can graft a pear onto a quince, or you can graft a pear onto a cotoneaster, but in reality, most of the time it's within the same genus. So apples onto apples, pears onto pears, cherries onto cherries. It gets a little goofy when you get to the genus Prunus because Prunus includes your apricots, your almonds, your peaches, your cherries, your plums. So there's a lot of goofy compatibility and incompatibility. You can graft a plum or an almond onto an apricot if you want, but then a sweet cherry won't take on it for whatever reason. But then you go to graft a pear onto a mountain ash and it'll take. So it's not always within the same genus, but typically that's a good rule. So if you want to graft apples, you want to graft them onto fellow apples. So that's usually your safest route. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay.
And someone else was asking about what type of crab apple to purchase and
Um,
where to get that.
So there's lots of options here locally. I think there's lots of amazing varieties. If you're driving around the spring, you see a lot of the purple flowers, you see the pink flowers, especially late May, early June. The thing is there's dozens of amazing cultivars of not only edible crab apples, or apples, but there's also lots of flowering crab apples that are planted as an ornamental. And a lot of people are planting them, especially trying to avoid the choke cherries and invasive potential. Crab apples won't be invasive here. So the thing is there's lots of options. It kind of depends on what your goals are. If you want to have a delicious like crab apple that will just you can make apple butter and you can make jelly for days, you can never go wrong with a doggo. I think doggos are lovely crab apples. They're dark maroon red. They're usually about an inch in diameter. You see them all around Anchorage. Usually in October, the leaves turn bright yellow, and you'll see the bright red fruit still hanging there. I think doggo is a great one that if you want to fill and process a bunch of crab apples, there's some beautiful flowering crab apples that you can also graft other branches on. Like, hey, I don't want an entire Norland apple tree, but I maybe have a flowering crab apple, maybe just graft a couple branches where a couple branches have green leaves versus the purple leaves up here. It's the thing is there it depends on what your goals are. Some of my favorite varieties of apple, like that you can grow here, are like Trailman Rescue. I love Zestar. And then flowering, I love oh, what is it? Royalty, I think, or maybe Burgundy. I don't know. Thunderchild is also beautiful as well. So there's lots of varieties, and when it comes to different places you can buy them, there's grafted cultivars of apples at almost every nursery here locally. Especially like whether you go to Bell's or you head out to Valley, go to Mid Valley or go to Ken's. I know Northern Fruit used to have lots of options as well. Um, yeah, there's lots of good options when it comes to buying apples. And again, if you also want to experiment, if there's a good crab apple in your neighborhood, there's nothing wrong. Even with the frozen fruit right now, you can go collect that fruit, extract the seeds from it, stratify them for a couple months, and plant them, and you can have your own crab apples, and then that's your own root stock. That's usually the route I go, but I'm not everybody, I guess. So there's lots of options though. Most of the nurseries are going to have good varieties though. So hopefully that answered your question. I think growing from seed is a lot of fun. So I highly recommend if you have that opportunity. So talking about plums, mind you, please ignore the fact on the left-hand side, I couldn't find a picture of a seedling plum within my all the plant photos on my phone. So that's a baby apricot. But if you could pretend with me, so on the right-hand side, would you believe that those are plums that are being grown outside in Palmer, Alaska? So it's a variety that we tentatively named Lanyap Gold. It may go by other names. We're still trying to figure out the original grower of it. It was a chance seedling that was grown in somebody's yard, southwest corner of their house, and it produces the most delicious yellow plums that ripen early to mid-September every year without fail. Mind you, in a good, very good microclimate, so even in cool summers, it's getting heat off the house. But they are some of the most delicious plums I've ever had. They're bright, they're juicy, they're citrusy, they're just and I could just eat them nonstop until my stomach was upset. And the thing is like this is a variety that isn't in the nursery trade. It's not a variety that's available that you can go buy at Raintree Nursery or Burnt Ridge Nursery down in Washington. This was a chance seedling that somebody planted. Whether they planted it there or they dug a sucker off somebody else's chance seedling, this tree is not grafted. It's originally its own tree. And so the cool thing is like this is the potential that we have when it comes to developing new fruits here. This chance seedling is now actually being propagated and we're actually growing it and getting it to other folks around the state of Alaska. This variety, I grafted a bunch of them last year. There's folks that are trialing it up in Fairbanks this year. See how hardy it actually is. We don't 100% know that. But because somebody took a chance and planted a seed, we now have a brand new yellow plum that is reliable here in South Central Alaska and it's delicious. And it's one of those that may be more adaptable across the area. And that's the thing too. Like what's adaptable in South Central Alaska may or may not adapt up in the interior. It may or may not adapt in Southeast Alaska. So that's why it's important that we kind of adapt this citizen science project to our ecoregions, to our climate. Because the thing is, what works down in Hoona won't work up in Fairbanks, which is won't work or may not work in Kodiak. But that's kind of cool. That's why if we localize experiment and kind of take it to the citizens, that's how we come up with the next Lanyap Gold Plum. And so that's kind of the potential of growing some of these seedlings, and that's kind of my hope out of this. Okay, cool. So the thing is,
Someone's asking how long does pollen keep?
um, I don't 100% have that answer. I know it can be stored for extended periods of time through refrigeration or freezing. Um, it, actually, that's kind of a segue, a little bit of a rabbit hole after this. But the thing is like I believe that through controlled conditions and when properly prepared, I believe it's months, if not a year. But I could be wrong in that. That's me spitballing. But I know there's folks that ship in pollen all the time, and I think that as long as the conditions are right, it should store properly. Hopefully that answered the question sort of without me knowing. Um, I also wanted to touch before I went down there. There's some folks like we talk about like all the like if you go to Bell's Nursery and you'll see like a Toka plum and you'll see Underwood plum and Pemina plum. What's cool about these is these are all hybrid plums that were developed in Minnesota and they're crossed with varieties that would never bloom together, that would never survive together. And so it's kind of cool when it comes to university programs. There's instances where they would have plums like, let's say you have an American plum which grows in Minnesota. It's a wild type plum, and it grows and it's going to bloom mid-May every year, no matter what. But then you want to cross it with our Lanyap Gold plum. You bring your Lanyap Gold plum down there. Oh, dang, it blooms 2 weeks earlier than your American plum, so you can't cross-pollinate that, even though you want to create a hybrid plum between the two of them. So the folks in the university system, they get crafty with that. They'll literally grow plum trees in like bathtubs or carts where they'll keep them in cold storage and then they'll bring them out to stagger them breaking dormancy. So basically you can then overlap the flowering and then end up with cross-pollination. I know there's a private grower in Wisconsin that does that. He literally has plum trees growing in bathtubs on wheels that he can roll out. So basically, hey, this one is going to be stacked, or is going to bloom 2 weeks earlier. So I'm going to basically keep it in cold storage until 2 weeks later, and then bring it out and let it cross-pollinate with the American plum. I think probably the university system's probably a little more precise. They probably store pollen or collect pollen, but I could be wrong in that assumption. But the thing is there's there's a lot of potential when it comes to crossing some of these. Here in Alaska, like when things warm up, the chances are most of our fruits are going to be blooming in the span of a couple weeks. Usually there's going to be some sort of overlap, but if there's not, you can get kind of crafty with that. Whether you try to delay, you can basically, oh, hey, this fruit tree is going to try to break dormancy earlier, so piling more snow there to keep it colder for longer. Or if it's in a pot, you can basically pull it out, or put, oh, this one you're going to plant on the north side of a building where it stays colder for longer, and then you cross pollinate them because they bloom at the same time. There's some fun experiments to be had if you're that committed. So, and that's something we can be doing with pears. We can be doing that with plums, apricots, cherries. We think of sour cherries, like the Evans sour cherry that I showed in the first slide. Evans is the most reliable variety and probably the highest yielding sour cherry we have here in South Central Alaska that we grow. Again, that chance seedling that somebody found in Edmonton, Alberta. The thing is like when you go up to Fairbanks, though, it's fairly reliable in the hills above the inversion, their little Goldilocks zone that they have. But when you plant it in the valley floor, at least historically speaking, it was not reliably hardy. Occasionally it would get damaged, especially in winters like what Fairbanks is having this year. So Evans wasn't necessarily the go-to variety if you lived in the valley floor. Mind you, I don't think they had many go-to cherry varieties, period, in the valley floor. But the thing is and now there's the University of Saskatchewan breeding program where you have the Romance series of cherries, and they're fairly reliable in the valley floor in those cold spots. But let's say even those aren't hardy enough. You live in the coldest of the coldest spot in Fairbanks, and you want to grow cherries, but basically Evans isn't cutting it. Carmine Jewel, Romeo, Juliet, they're not cutting it. What you can do is basically take seeds from the Carmine Jewel, the Romeo, the Evans, and plant them out, and they're still fruitful, so they're not going to be too far off from the parent. But the thing is, they still will genetically be their own unique individual. And you plant them out, and maybe one of those seedlings is 5 degrees hardier than the Evans. And maybe that's enough that will adapt to your local microclimate. So if you live on the edge of where you can grow some of these fruits, I think you should be collecting seeds. Basically, the farthest north they're being grown now, or the most extreme conditions they have now, collect seeds from that and plant out. And then at that point, it's a numbers game. And it's amazing. Alaska will weed out a lot of what's hardy or what's not hardy. And in that process, that's how you find those new varieties. So actually, Charles being on the call, one of the pears that I have is actually, I have some seedling pears in my nursery bed. They were originally from his Southworth pear, which is a beautiful European cultivar pear. He would never get any fruit because he didn't have any cross pollination. So he went to the boulevard and grabbed some Pyrus usariensis, which is your Usarian pear or your Siberian pear, incredibly hardy. And he took pollen from that and cross pollinated his European pear, and so set some fruit and saved those seeds. And so that's what we're growing now. So now, what those fruit will actually look like, I probably won't know for another 10 to 15 years. But there could be some really neat, like hybrid, like that's how they developed Golden Spice and Uri pears. They were crosses between European pears and Siberian pears. We could be in that batch, there could be a brand new variety of pear that's adaptable to Alaska's conditions. They're on year 3 and still surviving. So it's kind of just, don't be afraid to save seeds from Alaskan fruits because that's how we're going to find new varieties. So by now, most of us know that we can be growing a lot of fruits here in Alaska, and actually through a much wider area of Alaska than we would have ever expected. I think that there's certain varieties of crabapple that you can grow in the coldest spots of the interior. You could probably grow them in a high tunnel in Anitukvik Pass if you wanted to. In Southeast Alaska, if you can find an area where you can keep the wind off while they're raining or while it's raining, you probably get adequate pollination. The thing is like fruit culture here in Alaska has expanded rapidly with new varieties and changing parameters when it comes to our climate. But with us taking on the citizen science project, we can really help push that further and make basically fresh fruit grown in our communities available even to more extreme communities with more extreme or rigorous climates. So by now we all know that we can be growing lots of awesome fruits, but hey, hazelnuts, this is kind of my jam. So first and foremost, like most invasive species that we have were originally from well-intentioned plant people. So it's something that we have to be doing our due diligence to make sure we're not planting a problem. So things like hazelnuts, they just don't have the evolutionary characteristics of an invasive species, them being large, not wind distributed, and requiring rigorous cross-pollination. So that's why I feel comfortable in growing these. But the cool thing about hazelnuts is they're probably one of the most adaptable nuts that we're discovering. You think of your European hazelnut, your big filbert orchards you have in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and big, they're almost tree form, and that's basically where the entire industry is here in the United States. Well, that's not the only place you can grow hazelnuts, but the problem is those European hazelnuts are very like their parameters are very small. They need a mild climate. It can't get too cold in the winter. Anything below like -15 will damage the flower buds. Um, and they're very susceptible to an endemic blight, basically everywhere else in North America called Eastern filbert blight. And so basically, you can only grow the European filberts basically, in the Pacific Northwest or temperate areas of California. Well, in the Eastern United States, there's wild type hazelnuts like your Corylus americana and your Corylus cornuta, your American hazelnut, your beaked hazelnut. They grow wild as thicket species up into Saskatchewan and Alberta. Some of them are hardy to -50, and because they co-evolved with the Eastern filbert blight is just kind of it's more of a blemish. It doesn't kill the tree, it may just damage a branch. These plants have kind of co-evolved with this blight for thousands of years. So the thing is like it doesn't actually succumb, the tree doesn't die, while Eastern filbert blight would be a death sentence for European filbert. So folks in the upper Midwest, namely Minnesota, North Dakota, they're stubborn and they decide to take pollen from American hazel or from European hazelnuts and cross their American type hazelnuts and start creating these hybrid hazelnuts. And so that's where we're starting our experiment. So a lot of the hazelnuts I have planted, I wish I would have included a picture, hindsight being what it is. We have 3-year-old hazelnuts growing up in Fairbanks and they're almost 3 feet tall. I'm really excited about that. But they were originated from this grower called from Dan Johnson or Riverbend Hazelnuts in North Dakota. And he took hybrid hazelnuts that had been developed in southern Minnesota. He brought them up to the Red River Valley of North Dakota, and then he started back crossing them with northern Minnesota, North Dakota ecotypes of American hazelnut. And after 30, 40 years, he actually has varieties of hazelnuts that he's ready to release, adapted to the Red River Valley of North Dakota. So basically, I'm taking those seeds from him, and I'm like, well, will hazelnuts be adaptable here in Alaska? Yeah, you see that picture right there. Those are ripe hazelnuts I picked in Anchorage. But the thing is those won't necessarily grow in every condition. Not every seedling will be adaptable, but that's where the numbers game comes in. So Dan Johnson, I asked him, I was like, hey, we want to start the Future Crops Initiative. We want to grow, basically develop new crops to Alaska's conditions and maybe find some hazelnuts. We understand that you can go buy cultivars. You can go buy Yamhill or McDonald or the Beast or Grand Traverse. You can go buy varietals of hazelnut and plant them. But the thing is if they're not adaptable, you just wasted a bunch of money, and the chances are like you're not going to get a harvest because you basically put all your eggs in just a couple small baskets. But when you take seeds, from North Dakota. Basically, he collected seeds from his 20 earliest ripening and hardiest trees. He sent them north, and that's where we started from. So basically, the ones that adapted the best to his climate, we're now taking them a couple thousand miles north, and that's where we're starting our experiment from. And now it's a numbers game. Planting, not every seedling that you see in that batch is going to be adaptable to Alaska's conditions, but when you plant enough of them, some of them will be made of tougher stuff. Some will be more upright. Some will be lower growing. Some will have thick kernel shells. Some will have thin shells. Some will have poor kernel development or poor oil content. Some will have delicious kernel content. And so by planting those seeds, it basically you find Alaska will weed out the winners and the losers. And then when you have the winners, if you this one has thick shells, which isn't very desirable for cracking out, but then this one is not quite as hardy but has delicious hazelnuts, you then make pollen crosses between those two and then plant those offspring out. And that's basically at that point you are starting the science experiment that the universities have been doing for over a century. So the thing is, it's like hazelnuts are kind of a fun experiment where basically if you can grab hazelnuts from the farthest north range or where they're being grown economically or commercially right now and basically bring them here, that's a great way to start. But also recognizing that it is a numbers game and Alaska will weed some of them out. Planting some of these hazelnuts in like North Pole or Fairbanks, we recognize that a good chunk of them are not going to survive, but all it takes is a couple of them to be hardy to -50. And now you basically, if you can get those to survive, okay, hey, go get pollen from one of your neighbors and you can make crosses and start the next generation. And basically, through enough of that work, you can end up bringing hazelnuts that are adaptable to Alaska's conditions. And even maybe 30, 40 years down the road, we can release cultivars. Because the goal of like all these experiments is if you have a delicious variety of apple, or hazelnut that you have developed and it's just really well adapted and it produces excellent quality nuts or fruits. The thing is, at that point, you get to name it, and then we can then, if with proper permission, we can then start propagating it so other Alaskans can be growing those varieties. And so that's how new cultivars are developed, and that's how we're going to kind of work our way through this and find those new varieties. How we find the next Lagniappe Gold Plum, but in hazelnut edition. So we talk about fruits, and I've been talking about a lot of tree fruits and hazelnuts. It doesn't just have to be tree fruits and hazelnuts. There's endless potential. I think something that a lot of folks can be doing is right there on the left-hand side, those are haskaps. So what is it? Lonicera caerulea. So the honeyberry, these are things that a lot of us have in our yards already. It's a really widely adapted berry. They're hardy to -60. Some of the varieties are absolutely delicious. I'm sorry, Aurora is my favorite. But and the thing is these are all already delicious. The University of Saskatchewan has done an amazing job of breeding all these amazing cultivars that we now all have in our gardens, but there's nothing keeping you from growing seeds and seeing what comes out of them. Um, Mind you, you have to be careful. Like, again, if it's a patented variety, you don't want to be growing seeds there because you could be infringing, especially if it's like you're growing it to sell it. But if you're like growing it just as a backyard grower, you can really kind of create some cool cultivars. So right there, those are all Aurora seedlings, and I'm going to grow them out. I recognize that some of those are not going to be great. Some of them could be delicious, but it's kind of a fun experiment. Haskaps don't necessarily need cold stratification. A lot of times they will germinate just from fresh seed. So if you have a haskap bush in your yard, and you're willing to do some experiments, just mash the seeds in some soil and you'll get germination. Or if you want to stratify them, you can put them in the basically use the blender, remove the pulp, put them in moist peat moss, put them in the fridge, and then when you're ready, they will all germinate and you can grow them in flats and go plant a row of your own haskaps. And because haskaps have their rigorous pollination requirements, each of those is its own individual. So each of those, as long as there's overlap with flowering, you will end up with cross pollination. You don't have to worry about planting two different varieties. You already have over a dozen varieties right there. And so you're already going to get that cross pollination. So that's kind of cool thing about seedlings. So you could be doing that with haskaps. I think haskaps and Saskatoons are some of the easiest ones we could be doing that with in our backyards. It gets a little more funky when you want to start doing raspberries because raspberries, unfortunately, they have that evolutionary characteristic. They want to survive. Basically, animals are meant to be their mechanism of distribution within the ecosystem. So basically, the berries have to survive the passage through the animal. So basically, they have a hard outer seed coat, so you have to overcome that with scarification. So professional raspberry breeders will sometimes use like battery acid to help scarify the outer seed coat before they go to stratify them. I ferment them and use a blender, so it is doable. But raspberries take a little more. It's a little more of a process before you get them to germinate. But things like haskaps and Saskatoons, they're super easy, and I think everybody can be growing those. And I would love to find new varieties of haskaps that are adapted to our conditions. So, any questions so far? Okay. Getting into my meat and potatoes, because I love growing, especially our native berries. The thing is, we think of developing new fruits and new nuts and things like that. We think of the tree fruits, we think of like ornamental or commercial varieties. It doesn't just have to apply to that. It can apply to specifically our native species. And so when it comes to breeding, the thing is we can absolutely be growing and selecting our own varieties of our own native fruits that are more adaptable within our gardens. If you have salmon berries and you like it, I found it interesting when I went down to Kodiak. I didn't know this, but in the Kodiak region, salmon berries, Rubus spectabilis, they actually call the yellow salmon berries the Russian berry, and they call the red ones salmon berries. But the yellow ones are occasional at best in the Kodiak archipelago. I was unaware of that. Botanically, they're both the same species, but they make the distinction down there because the yellow ones are not as common. While you go to Prince William Sound, the yellow is probably the most prevalent ecotype. Or phenotype, whatever it is. But the thing is like we can actually be selecting. Like, let's say you want to be growing salmon berries in your Anchorage backyard. I'm probably not going to be going to the southern end of the range. I'm probably not going to be going to Northern California, the redwood forest, and collecting salmonberry seeds there and planting them and growing them in my Anchorage yard because it's just the genetics aren't there. The parents of those salmonberries are not the ones that are going to be adaptable within my region. They're going to be the ones that like maybe push them up to Seattle, cool, grow in the Pacific Northwest, but they're not going to be the ones that are the hardiest for us in Anchorage, where we're kind of pushing the bounds on salmonberries. So I'm going to go to the northernmost range that they have. Samberries, the northernmost range that I know of is Girdwood, and then there's one gulch above Indian that has them as well. Supposedly they're listed as an occasional species up in Denali State Park. I would love to get my hand on some of those berries because that would be by far the hardiest and farthest north of the species exists in North America. But the thing is, like if I'm trying to grow them in my cold, dry yard in Anchorage, I'm going to try to get the northernmost, most locally adapted varieties and then bring them over. And then again, it's that numbers game. And if you like one that has yellow fruit, basically you let them grow and you cull the ones that have red fruit, you replant the ones that have yellow fruit. Maybe you'll find one that has especially large yellow fruit, and now you have a selection of salmonberry. So the thing is it doesn't just apply to our big tree fruits or our nuts. We could be doing this with our native berries as well, and I think we should be doing that. So this is actually kind of,
Hey, Josh.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Eve asked, is anyone working on black walnut in Alaska?
Oh, no, but I think somebody should. Black walnuts, we actually, and actually, I don't know if I included the pictures or not. Let's see. Oh, nope, I didn't. So it's actually fun because we're actually discovering walnuts that are growing here in Anchorage and some of them that are actually ripening. Um, so black walnuts, that work is not currently being done. We only know of one living example of a black walnut in Midtown Anchorage. It's growing. There's a couple people that have small trees, but there is like a 25 foot tree up against the south side of somebody's two-story townhouse in Midtown, not far from the Seward Highway. And the last couple of years have been too cool, so the nuts haven't actually ripened. But it's full size and it actually produces large crops of black walnuts that just don't completely fill. But the thing is I think that work can absolutely be done. Um, it's going to be, again, we kind of need a citizen scientist to kind of take up the reins on that one and want to experiment with it. That's kind of what I started with hazelnuts and native berries. So if you want to take it with black walnuts, what I would recommend is go get black walnuts from the northernmost part of their range. Again, seed importing from Canada because I think there's black walnuts that grow in like Edmonton, Alberta, maybe Grand Prairie. But then you run into the regulations of importing seeds across international borders. You'd have to figure out the logistics there and making sure you have the proper authorization to bring the seeds in. But even if you got seeds from like northern Minnesota or North Dakota, I think that that would be a solid place to start. And then again, it's just that numbers game, finding good, favorable microclimates. Because I don't think a black walnut's going to grow everywhere here in South Central. It's going to have to be the warmest, sunniest exposures. If you have if you have a wall, if you have a fence, if you have a steep southern facing slope, if you have a decent rock outcrop, I think that's going to be the most beneficial spot for a black walnut. But it's going to be just kind of that numbers game and kind of see how it goes. My experience with black walnuts is outside of the warmest microclimates. It's not that they're not hardy, they just don't finish their growth cycle in time and harden off in the fall adequately before we get our first hard freeze. Places like North Dakota get beautiful continental summers where it's nice and warm, so they have plenty of time to grow, finish their growth cycle, and then go dormant in the fall. Even though North Dakota arguably gets colder temperatures in the winter, it's just we have a cool enough summer that they don't necessarily finish that life cycle. But in the right microclimate and the right seed source, it's worthy of trial. There's varieties like your butternut Juglans scenario or Juglans manchurica, your Manchurian walnut that are actually rather well adapted. Butternut likes to die back every couple of years, except in the warmest spots. Manchurian walnuts are fully hardy. There's even a 25 foot Manchurian walnut in the hills above Fairbanks at the old Claire Lammers orchard. And actually, it produced ripe walnuts last year, and I know a gentleman who was actually able to grow some seedlings from it. The Manchurian walnuts are probably the most adaptable here, but unfortunately, it's a wild type butternut from East Asia and thick shells, lots of compartments, not necessarily the best eating. But something that kind of has me intrigued is over in Russia, they did a lot of awesome breeding work with Manchurian walnuts and actually crossing them with English walnuts and butternuts and black walnuts. So there's some really neat hybrids that exist in Russia. It's just unfortunately when it comes to the world right now, getting seeds from Russia is not necessarily the most feasible. But I think there's some really neat genetic potential and hybrid potential. And something I would actually be curious to try is if you could find Manchurian walnuts, try grafting in a black walnut onto them and see if that has any impact on whether that helps them harden off earlier, or if that helps them survive better. I don't know what the compatibility is, but I think it'd be a neat experiment. So, black walnuts are not, as far as I know, are not being done right now, but I would love to see somebody try it. And that's also one of those species that the big black walnuts, they're not going to be bird distributed. They're not going to be wind distributed. So other than maybe one popping up in your neighbor's backyard, they're not going to be invasive in this climate. So that'd be a fun experiment. So does that answer your question? What was that? Oh,
Um, and then Noah also asked, how long does it typically take a seed propagated berry bush to fruit? And then
It,
Chad's asking how deep of soil is ideal for fruit and nut trees. And then I just wanted to give you time is 12:53. So
oh, perfect. I thought I was under.
yeah.
So, okay, what was the first one again? Oh, how long for
Sorry.
the,
Yeah, yeah.
so
Propagated from
completely depends on the species. I've come to discover that if you stratify them and start them early indoors, you can actually bump up that timeline by a couple years. I like with our native blueberries, I can get a blueberry plant to potentially, I think my oldest blueberry plant is coming up on 3 years old, and I think it's gonna produce fruit either this year or next year. But I think if I would have just grown it outside, it probably would have been 5 to 7 years. But 4 to 5 is actually pretty good. Things like I grow thimbleberries from seed. I think by year 3 I'm going to get fruit off of those. But haskaps, my oldest haskaps are going on year 3 now, and I think they're going to flower next year. So I think that it's going to vary from site to site, attention and how much input you put in. But I think some of these you're probably looking at anywhere between 3 and 5 years, but it's going to depend on the species and the conditions. Um, and then to touch on the soil, first I would definitely before you plant anything, I would definitely get a soil test and see what needs to be amended. I know there's some areas here locally that have really shallow soil on top of gravel. That's one of those where you could start mulching with wood chips. You can try amending with a little bit of topsoil. I don't have a definitive answer, but usually I try to like you have to figure most of our trees, like the roots aren't going very deep to begin with, and that's not unique. Like fruit trees are going to be the same way. Most roots of a fruit tree are not going to be going below 2 feet, even with in good conditions. And then here in Alaska with our cold soils, there's no nutrients below 2 feet. So I would imagine somewhere between 1.5 and 2 feet, and then with adequate mulching and supplemental nutrients, I think that would be fine. If you have really gravelly soil, you can amend it with a little bit of topsoil and then add good layers of mulch, which will eventually break it down. Unfortunately, here in Alaska, it's just a lot of us have very shallow, very young soils because the ice age was rude and took all our topsoil out to the ocean. So it's just what you have. Just try to start building it however you can, whether it's cover crops and mulching and maybe a little bit of topsoil just to help with some water retention. But I think that with a little bit of amending, I think you can definitely get it within 1 to 2 feet of soil, even less. So, was there another question, Iva?
Yeah, we've got a couple more.
Okay.
Kimberly is asking if you know what Salamatov plans to do with the berry farm in Soldotna.
Ooh, I actually am not familiar, but I'd love to know based off of what they end up doing. So, but I
Yeah,
have not been tracking.
I wasn't aware of that either. And then Chad is asking about the citizen science project, whether it's just a saying that you have, or is there something official that people can get involved with?
So the official we call it officially like with the university with Jody Anderson and the Matanuska Experience Farm, we call it the Future Crops Initiative. That's what we enrolled with the university. But we call it a citizen science project because we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We've seen time and time again with university systems, especially here in Alaska, ag is not going to be the priority when it comes to state funding. And whenever there's cuts to be made at the state level, agriculture and state funding with the university is usually one of the first things to get cut. So putting all our eggs in just the university basket would be basically setting ourselves up for failure. So we call it a citizen science project. That's more of a saying, a quick answer. But it's basically encouraging more folks to basically expand what we're doing there, but in their backyards, in their communities, in their community gardens, in their villages, on their homesteads. So we're basically broadening our chances of finding those chance seedlings. And then once we find a great one with proper permission, we propagate it and start distributing it to other growers who may not have the space to grow some of these or to develop some of these. So when I say citizen science project, it's more of just Alaskans collaborating and sharing, hey, I learned this real time. I have this variety real time and working together and sharing that information and just inspiring others to be doing it as well. So kind of taking what the university is doing, but basically less eggs in one basket and just kind of sharing the wealth, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Okay, so I'll touch on this one a little bit before again, I want to be a steward of your guys' time. But something else that I see as a potential too, and again, I may be kind of off on this one, but we think of like our native berries. Like right here, we have Rubus chamaremorus, also known as your cloudberry, your uckpick, your baked appleberry, your salmonberry for folks in Western Alaska. Um, we think of them as a monolith of they're all just adapted to the same conditions. They all grow in alpine environments. And basically the challenge is then with climate change, especially in the Arctic, where you end up with less consistent snowfall, or you end up with icing events, or you end up with freeze thaw, or late spring frost. You end up with crops of ukpik that may not actually set very well or not reliably. Um, so an interesting experiment I kind of want to play with is cloudberries grow down in coastal. Like if you go to a muskeg bog in Ketchikan, cloudberries grow down there as well. They grow down in the mountains. They grow all. They're circumpolar species. So what if we were to actually grow seeds from different regions and make crosses to help basically adapt maybe some of the northern ones to with more of the southern genetics? Maybe the ones in Ketchikan, because they're used to the freeze thaw, wet, cold, they're not going to start growing the first time it hits 50 degrees, because 50 degrees in January is a non-event in Ketchikan. 50 degrees is means it's summer up in Utqiagvik. So the thing is like, what if we were to actually start playing around with actually making crosses of some of our native berries from different regions and growing out those seeds and maybe making selections? Mind you, this is a pipe dream. This is down the road, and but this is kind of where my lens when it comes to developing new varieties of fruits for Alaska and Alaska's conditions. I think that there's a lot of potential in working with our native species and making them more adaptable to whether it's growing in your backyard, growing in community gardens, or adapting plants from with southern genetics to helping the northern plants adapt to the changes that are happening. I don't 100% know how that's going to go, but I think that the solution to that is, or I think that at least the right track to that is always growing more of them. So right here, you can see I'm growing a lot of Rubus chamaemeris from seed. I think the big moral of all this conversation is don't be afraid to grow some of these. If you understand stratification, go collect seeds. If you go pick apples at a local orchard, grow some of the seeds. It doesn't have to be a controlled pollen cross. If you have a Norland apple and a Parkland apple growing next to each other and you save the seeds, chances are they're both good apples. Chances are the offspring is going to be something that's at least halfway decent. If anything, it's a rootstock for other varieties. But don't be afraid. If you go pick local plums, if you pick sour cherries off your neighbor's yard, there's nothing wrong with planting them. You could stratify them in your fridge. You can just clean the seeds and go plant them in nursery beds. They may or may not grow. But the thing is like, don't be afraid to grow some of these seeds. I think that for the longest time, the 1 in 10,000 good apples that go out, or that be, or 1 in 10,000 seedlings that becomes a good apple, I think that's hindered a lot of people for a long time of, oh, like the odds are just not worth it. The thing is, we're not trying to come up with the next cosmic crisp apple. We just want varieties that are delicious. They grow in our backyard. And if they have a little bit of russeting or they're not the prettiest apple, we don't care. We just want apples that are functional within our communities that help feed our communities. So, and I think the way we're going to find these new varieties is more Alaskans picking up the reins and being armed with the knowledge to go out and just let's grow some of these things. Let's share the knowledge real time. Let's share resources back and forth, and let's be part of that citizen science project. And let's help just work our way towards food security here in the state of Alaska. Is this going to be food security? No, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. So I think we can all do it, and especially if we work together. Because Alaska, we don't have a time for other regions to be figuring it out for us. We have to figure it out ourselves.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's always so inspiring to hear you talk about plants. Such a good friend to the plants.
Thank you, friend.
And yeah. Uh, and then I just wanted to confirm, uh, what fruit would you graft onto a mountain ash? You mentioned it, but someone
Ooh,
or
pair grafting gets fun because
okay.
like I said, the rule of pair, so pears belong to the genus Pyrus. So typically, you'd be grafting pears onto fellow pears. It gets weird because like there's some European pears that actually won't graft onto Siberian pears, but they'll graft onto quince, they'll graft onto mountain ash, they'll graft onto cotoneaster and Saskatoon and hawthorn. Because in while they're not in the same genus, they're close enough related and they're all pomes, so they are compatible. But it gets a little weird because like if I wanted to go graft, if you have a cotoneaster bush in your front yard and you want to graft a pear onto it, absolutely you can graft a pear on that and it'll last 60 to 80 years, max out as a 6 to 8 foot tall pear tree, and be precocious and produce tons of giant pears. But the problem is you have to leave a couple of the cotoneaster branches on the bottom called a nurse branch. Because if you remove all the nurse branches, the pear is greedy and doesn't like to basically feed its nutrients back to the cotoneaster roots in the fall. So the roots end up just starving because it doesn't have any way to photosynthesize and it dies. But if you basically graft a pear onto like a mountain ash or a cotoneaster, you leave a couple of the rootstock branches so it can photosynthesize, and then you graft the cultivar pear on top of it. It will grow, and you will actually. It's rather precocious with the mountain ash. It's not necessarily the most long-lived. Usually grafted about chest high and leave some branches, but you can graft a pear onto mountain ash. And with a cotoneaster, again, you could have a 60 to 80-year-old pear tree that's only 8 feet tall. So I've read the literature out of the Soviet Union. I'd love to learn more about that and kind of experiment with that. But there is potential. Within genus is typically the rule, but those rules don't always apply. So pears are goofy.
Thanks, Josh. Just a bunch of people are saying thank you. I'm not sure if you
100%.
can see that, but and then the last question is, what are you planning on grafting onto what you have growing on your mustache?
Uh, Unfortunately, so all I'll say is I've done a lot of grafting through the years, and there was one time I attempted to graft my thumb with an apricot, not compatible. So unfortunately, I think the compatibility range is going to be pretty narrow with the mustache. So I may just leave it ungrafted. It may just be a glorified rootstock for life.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. I think that's it.
And if you guys
See
ever have
y'all
any
later.
questions or if you guys are interested, I'm a wealth of knowledge. I'll share, or not wealth of knowledge, but I'm an open book. So anything that I've know or experienced, I will absolutely share it. So reach out to me on social media and I will absolutely get back to you because I want you to be growing it as well. So best of luck though, and happy growing.
Thanks, Josh.